Before we get into today's stories, never miss an update by signing up for the Dread Weekly newsletter on dreadsarmy.com. The link is in the description too. Get the latest encounters, trail camera footage, and news in your inbox once a week. Now, let's get to the story. I'm a construction worker by trade, but I have a thing for hiking and exploring the wild. That's why I was up on the Applegate Trail in the Northwest last week. It's a tough trail to beat, but nothing out of the ordinary. Well, that was until I saw it. My usual haunt is the Great Smoky Mountains, but this time I decided to head off to explore something different, something more rugged and wild. That's why I chose Applegate. I'd heard a lot about the trail over the years, the challenge it presented, the breathtaking views it offered. But there were also whispers of something else. Local legends, stuff about odd happenings and strange sightings. I never put much stock in those stories, but that was before I saw it. I'd set up camp for the night in a clearing near a creek. A quiet spot, perfect for a peaceful night's sleep. Only this time, it wasn't quiet at all. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by some sort of noise sounded like a grunt or a growl. Not sure exactly, but it was unusual to say the least. It started subtly. Not the usual sounds of the forest at night. No, this was different. It was a low rumble that seemed to shake the ground beneath me. I thought it was an earthquake at first, but the trees remained still. Only the ground beneath me trembled. Then there were scrapes and scratches, like claws on tree bark. I've heard bears in the night before, but this was like no bear I've ever heard. There was a rhythm to it, almost like a pattern, and it was this pattern that added an edge to the already unsettling noises. Along with the strange rumbling and scratching sounds, there was a peculiar odor. It was a smell you never forget once you've experienced it. It hung heavy in the air, clinging to my clothes and my gear. It made me think of something primal, something ancient that didn't belong in our world, yet here it was. And the feeling of being watched grew more intense with every passing minute. I was sure that something was out there, studying me, biding its time. It felt like a predator that was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I know, sounds cliche, but I just couldn't shake it off. I tried to put it off as some animal, but there was something unnatural about the whole thing. And then, as I sat by the dying embers of my fire, I saw it. There, by the edge of the clearing, stood a figure that towered over me. 8 feet tall, at least. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. It stood upright but moved awkwardly, as if not used to its towering stature. The glow from the dying fire caught its eyes. They were yellow, piercing. The evil in them, it was undeniable. Its eyes. They were like 2 glowing orbs cutting through the darkness like headlights on a desolate road. There was a cruel sort of intelligence in them, a chilling malice that sent shivers down my spine. It was as if those eyes had seen me, really seen me, and they knew what I feared. It was a horrifyingly surreal moment, one where I realized that this creature wasn't just a mere inhabitant of the wild. It was something more, something uncanny, and I was in its territory. I've seen alligators, and I've seen crocodiles up close in my trips to the Everglades. The facial features on this creature, they were similar but grossly out of place on a body that stood upright. It was an unnerving sight, I'll tell you that. In a moment that seemed to stretch out for an eternity, we just stared at each other. I didn't dare to move, nor did I dare to breathe. But then it left me. The way it moved was as if it was torn between walking like a man and lumbering like a beast. It crashed through the underbrush, each step causing the ground to shudder under its weight. The trees seemed to part in its path as though even they were afraid to stand in its way. I remember feeling an overwhelming sense of relief, and dread relief that it was leaving, and dread for the lingering presence it left behind. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and I kept the fire going until the break of dawn. As soon as I could see the trail clearly, I packed up and got the hell out of there. I've been hiking and exploring for decades, but I've never experienced anything like this before. It has left an impact, that's for sure. Every rustle, every grunt I hear in the wild now, it sends a chill down my spine. I guess some things you just can't shake off. My grandpa told me this story many times. I've heard it since I was a little kid, and it's always freaked me out. It was during World War II. He was fighting in France, and they were trying to clear the Germans from a city in northwest France, in the region of Normandy. The city had to be taken because it sat on an important crossroads for supplies and reinforcements. He said they were fighting and moving from hedgerow to hedgerow. The vegetation was extremely dense, and they could hardly see around them. He said his commanding officers were always worried about turning a corner and finding the enemy just waiting for them on the other side. Some of the hedgerows were 12 feet high and acted as walls or as natural fortifications. The Germans had machine gun nests and trenches dug out around them. It was some of the worst fighting he had ever experienced. He never really got into too much detail about the fighting itself. I had asked my mother once why that was, and she just looked at me and smiled and said that it was too hard for him to remember all the terrible things that happened there. My grandpa said that they had fought amongst the hedgerows for 2 months. That's when the really weird stuff started to happen, he said. One evening, when it was starting to get dark, my grandpa's men came up to an area that the Germans had prepared but never attacked from. There were weapons and equipment set up, but no soldiers. He said they found food, canteens, and other gear, all of it just left untouched. They couldn't understand why it was just left out without any soldiers around. Some of the ammunition boxes seemed to have blood smeared on them, but it was hard to tell in the low light. Grandpa said after they went through everything they found, they began to push forward again. A machine gun then started firing, and they all hit the dirt, finding holes to crawl into. He said it was when he was laying down a hole that he saw something, a dark shadow moving fast on 4 legs. It was running the hedgerow line but then disappearing. He said he swore he heard snarling and growling, and Germans yelling to each other. He didn't speak German, so he didn't know what they were saying. Another shadow flashed past where he was lying in the grass, and then another. The machine suddenly stopped. He said they could hear yelling and then screams in the night air. No one knew what was going on. With the machine stopped, some of the soldiers began to throw grenades into the trenches and holdouts, blasting the machine gun nest to oblivion. It didn't matter, he said. That's when a look always overtook my grandpa. It looked like half confusion and half horror. At this point, his eyes shone like glass. He'd look away from me but describe what they had found. The grenades found their marks, but it didn't matter. When he and his men came up on the nests and dugouts, the Germans were already dead. They were ripped to shreds. Some were missing limbs. Others were face down with strange wounds all over their bodies. The medics didn't find any alive, and they were unsure what they had died from. It wasn't shrapnel. They weren't killed by bullets either. It was like an animal had found them and torn them to shreds. My grandpa told his commanding officers what he saw. They didn't believe him though. Not with all the gunfire, mortars, and other explosions going off around them. There would be no way. Animals would be roaming these hedgerows not until the gunfire stopped. He supposed they were right, but he couldn't shake what he saw. It was confirmed later on, late into the night. Howling, yipping, barking. They heard it all during the night, but they couldn't see a thing. They had heard growling and snarling as well. Heard things move around them, some as close as a few feet or so. They moved on the next day, getting closer and closer to the city. He said that they fought all day and were exhausted by the night, but they had moved in and around some farmhouses that had been blasted apart. He saw them again that evening, right before it got really dark. Shadows moving through the area, moving fast and silently at first. He told the men around him to keep their eyes peeled for anything. They started to get shelled though, and began to spread out over the area. When he and some of his men dropped down under some hedgerows, he saw them clear as day. They were wolves, dark and fast. They were moving amongst the trees, the hedgerows, and the buildings. He couldn't believe it. There were wolves moving through a battleground, moving like they were on the hunt. When one of the wolves went to jump on one of his men, that was by the farmhouse he shot at it to scare it away. But it didn't work. The wolf grabbed the man's arm and sunk its teeth in. It was the man himself who got the wolf off with his knife. 3 more came running in, and my grandpa and his men fired on the wolves, hitting all 3. The artillery was coming down heavier now, and they all dropped down trying to lay under the hedgerows, near trees, anywhere to protect themselves from the shells. When the morning came, they explored the area in the light. My grandpa said he went up to the wolves and looked over them. He couldn't believe what he found. Around the neck of one of the dead wolf bodies were German identification tags. Why would wolves have German soldier identification tags around its neck? My grandpa and his men told their commanding officer what had happened. He didn't believe them at first, not until they told him they had bodies as proof. He looked them over with my grandpa and he showed the officer the tags around the one wolf's neck. He said his commanding officer spat, then looked up at him. He said the officer laughed and said, "You know, it's the damn desk thing, Sergeant. There's a report of a wolf found with British tags east of here too." He then looked back down at the wolf, laughed again, and walked away. My grandfather never did understand what that all meant. Do you have any ideas? I'm a police officer, and I've been working the night shift in the rural outskirts of an Ohio city for the last 10 years. Most of the time, it's quiet, the kind of silence that hangs heavy in the air, especially on those long, uneventful drives. On the night of June 15, we received an unusual call, a homeowner claiming some disturbance in his backyard. Normally, it's an animal or a drunk neighbor, but this time, the fear in the man's voice got to me. He sounded terrified, almost on the brink of hysterics. Even as I tried to reassure the homeowner over the radio, his panicked words kept ringing in my ears. "Something's not right, officer. I've lived here all my life, and I've never seen anything like this." I remember the tremor in his voice, the urgency, and for a moment I forgot the protocol. Instead of asking him to stay on the line with me, I remember telling him I'm on my way. His place was 15 minutes out from where I was. During the drive, my mind began to churn over the man's words. I'd spoken to scared people before, it's part of the job, but this was different. This man was a hardy Midwesterner, a guy who'd seen his share of harsh winters and stormy nights. And he was scared. It added a layer of seriousness, a sense of dread that kept building as I neared his property. As I arrived at the location, I remember thinking how eerily quiet it was. The moon was a thin crescent, barely lighting up the vast landscape. Everything was still, too still. That's when I first heard it, a strange clicking sound, almost like 2 stones clashing together, only it was rhythmic and persistent. I couldn't place where it was coming from. The sound seemed to bounce off the empty, quiet fields around me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Stepping out of my patrol car, I found the surrounding area to be unnervingly still. The silence was punctuated only by that strange clicking sound. Looking around, I noticed something else. The house was in darkness. No porch light, no room lights. Even the nearby street lamp was out, which was odd because I distinctly remember it being functional the last time I patrolled this area. It was as if the whole place was swallowed up in darkness, creating this odd sense of isolation. I pulled out my flashlight and began my approach, the beam cutting through the darkness, but it was that sound, that persistent clicking, that continued to dominate the scene. It seemed to be coming from all directions, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. It felt as though the sound was closing in on me, creating an intense sense of unease. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. I turned, expecting to see a startled deer. Instead, I saw something that I still struggled to describe. It was around 6 feet, gaunt, and moved on all fours with surprising agility and speed. Its face. There was no nose, just large black eyes that seemed to absorb the weak moonlight, and an open mouth that never seemed to close. It was darting between the shadows like a wild animal. It was disturbingly fast, too fast for something of that size. As my flashlight beam landed on its face, it paused. The face was pale, almost ghost-like in the harsh light of the flashlight. It had large black eyes that seemed devoid of any emotion, a gaping mouth that stayed open in a silent scream. There was no nose, just smooth, pallid skin. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The creature with its unnerving gaze, and me, a police officer reduced to a silent, frozen spectator, unable to comprehend what I was witnessing. I froze. Fear does that to you, makes your blood run cold and your heart race. My mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but all I could do was stand there. The silence seemed to stretch into eternity, a standoff between me and this impossible creature. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum, echoing the rhythm of that relentless clicking sound. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, the only source of light in my makeshift weapon against whatever was before me. But then, as if sensing my fear, the creature suddenly moved. It darted off into the darkness with an incredible speed that seemed almost unnatural. Its movement was fluid, like water slipping through fingers. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. In the weeks following the encounter, I tried to convince myself it was a figment of my imagination. I told myself it was a product of the late hour and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. Despite a thorough investigation of the property, in the light of day, we found no trace of the creature. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing that could corroborate my encounter. But even without physical evidence, the encounter had left a deep mark on me. Every night since then, I've dreamt of those large black eyes, the open mouth, and heard that rhythmic clicking noise. And every day, I found myself scanning the shadows, half expecting to see that creature again. The experience has cast a long shadow over my life, an echo that follows me into every dark corner and empty street. Though I try to carry on with my duties as an officer, a part of me is always back in that yard, flashlight in hand, locked in a silent standoff with a creature that should not exist. And the worst part? I can't shake off the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. Hi, Donovan. Someone recently recommended your channel to me. I've been listening for a couple of weeks now, and it's made me want to write in with my own experience. After this situation happened, I really tried to put it behind me. I really didn't want to think about it too much. I mean, I want to be vigilant and have common sense and all, but if I spent too much mental energy on that, I might never go outside. When I was in my 20s, I was on a camping trip with a couple of my friends in Central Florida. 2 of us were rangers for the National Park Service at the time. That gave us the privilege of camping for free in other parks in the state. We had all done a lot of camping before. I grew up camping with my family on almost all our vacations in one form or another. We had camped all over the state of Florida and were very familiar with the environment. On this trip, we were camping in the youth area since it was empty that week. It was quieter and more isolated than the regular campsites. The first day, we just spent our time reading and relaxing and whatnot. Some of the rangers on duty came by to shoot the breeze with us. When you work for the Park Service, you tend to acquire a lot of wild stories to tell. We hung out for a while, and then me and my 2 friends got busy with our dinner prep and stuff. It was a quiet night. The second day in the afternoon, we were all sort of spread out in the area of the campsite. We were all within shouting distance of each other, but also enjoying a little solitude. I was collecting firewood. Every now and then, I kind of started feeling like something was watching me. But it wasn't super uncomfortable. Just a weird sensation. I'd look around, but I wouldn't see or hear anything. So I'd shrug it off and go back to what I was doing. Later on, around sunset, we had the bonfire started. One of the rangers who lived on site about a quarter mile away came over with a truckload of firewood and some fish he had caught. We all sat around talking and grilling our food. After dark, when it was around 9, we started hearing what sounded like a bunch of people fooling around on one of the trails a little distance away. Since the trails were supposed to be closed at sunset, the ranger and my coworker drove off to shoo them back to their campsites. My other friend and I were just relaxing around the fire, talking a little, mostly enjoying the night and the peace and quiet. All of a sudden, I had a cold chill go over me, like someone had just walked over my grave. I was covered with goosebumps. I just started feeling terrified out of nowhere. I tried to ignore it, but it kept building. I didn't want to say anything to my friend in order not to scare her. But then we both looked over at each other at the same time. She said, "Do you feel that?" I said, "Yeah. I think maybe we better go to the car." We both felt like we were in danger, but we had no idea from what. We started walking at a casual pace, not wanting to appear scared. We only made it about 10 yards before I felt something staring at me from behind and to the right. Immediately, all my senses went on red alert as I quieted my breathing so that I could listen into the foliage. I could hear a shifting of the environment just beyond the edge of the path. It was subtle, but I could tell by the sound that whatever it was sounded large. My heart started beating faster, but I tried to tell myself I was being too paranoid. I was thinking it might be a boar, or God forbid, a Florida panther, which are rare, but people still see them occasionally. I could feel the energy moving behind me. I felt like we were being stalked, and I pressed my hand on the fixed blade I had hanging from my belt. I risked a look behind me and saw something pale and thin just off the edge of the path. It was crouched down on all fours. Even in the hunched down position, it was still huge, at least 6 feet long. It was almost totally white, without many facial features, except it stared at us with black eyes and an open mouth. It seemed crusty and dry. When I looked at it, it started making a clicking sound. We were about 15 yards from the car when my friend and I looked at each other again and simultaneously broke into a dead run. We reached the car, jumped in and locked the door and turned on the headlights. My pistol was in the car and I sat there holding it, but my hands were shaking so badly. We both just sat looking straight ahead. I don't know how long we sat there, but at one point we both were sure we saw something slinking away. It was like we could actually feel that energy pulling away. I called the ranger and tried to describe what we had seen. He could tell by the sound of my voice that I was seriously messed up. I have never been that scared before or since. I have faced a lot in my life, wandered around the woods and all, and nothing has so completely terrified me like that. I don't know what it was, but I'm still convinced we were in danger. We did end up sleeping on the ranger's living room floor that night and collected our gear the next day. Every Thanksgiving, I take my family down to New Jersey to visit my grandparents. They're getting older, and I want my 2 boys to spend as much time as possible with them before the inevitable happens. They live on an immense piece of property not too far from the Wharton State Forest. They aren't overly wealthy or anything. The land has been in my family's hands for over 100 years. My grandfather used to operate a farm on it, but those days are long gone. We were going to stay a total of 5 days. It was just me, my wife, 2 sons, and grandparents, so it was a quiet Thanksgiving, at first anyway. My grandparents went to bed super early, so we had more of a Thanksgiving lunch. Around 6 p.m., it had just started getting dark, and me and my wife were finishing up the cleaning while my grandparents rested in the living room. Our oldest asked if he could take his 3-year-old brother outside to play for a little bit, and we both thought it would be fine. About 100 yards away from the back of the house is a small pond, maybe 20 feet wide. It wasn't more than a foot deep, and there were no fish in it. Deer and other critters would often come from the nearby woods to grab a drink from it. We told my son to stay away from it, more so that they didn't accidentally get wet rather than from any danger of drowning. He's a good kid, smart and responsible, so we didn't have any worries about letting him play outside. That was a mistake. About 20 minutes had passed, and I was at the sink wiping down the last bowl when something made me raise my head and look out the kitchen window. The view from the window encompassed a good portion of the back of the property, including the little pond. The sun was almost down, but I could just make out a large shape, head bent down over by the pond. I dropped my bowl in the sink and quickly rushed out the back door. Deer are common in the area, and if this thing was as big as I thought it was, then it was probably a buck. They were usually harmless, but I'd seen plenty of YouTube videos of them attacking people and wanted to get my kids back inside, but they were nowhere in sight. The view from the back door isn't as good. My grandmother kept a substantial garden and had some high rose bushes that she was proud of. I walked quickly around them and with a quiet sigh of relief, caught sight of my two boys. Only something was definitely wrong. I could see them, about 100 feet away, hunkered down behind the stump of a large tree my grandfather had removed a few years ago. It seemed like my oldest son had his hand clamped around the younger one's mouth, who was starting to squirm and fidget. I started towards them and came around the rose bushes, which gave me a view of the pond. I got a better look at the thing and felt a flood of panic when I realized that it wasn't a deer. The thing was the size of a big horse, at least 7 feet high. I could see a pair of thick curled horns, like a ram would have, rising from both sides of its head. It was hard to tell exactly, but I could almost swear it had a set of wings tucked in against the sides of its body. I felt a sense of unexplainable dread wash over me. Something in my mind was screaming for me to flee, but there was no way I would ever have left my kids. Almost immediately, another fear. Being seen by this thing came over me and I dropped to the ground. I crawled army style the rest of the way to where the kids were, and after about halfway, they spotted me. I gave my oldest the signal to stay put, and even the younger one calmed a bit when he saw me. I couldn't see the creature from my vantage point, but I could feel that it was still there. Eventually, I got to them and could see some tension ebb from their panic-stricken faces. I popped my head over the stump and could see the creature was still there, though something appeared to have drawn its attention away from us. It was looking at the tree line at the back of the property. We had a problem. I couldn't crawl with my youngest son, and wouldn't dare let him out of my grasp once I had him. The older one would be fine, but I didn't want to separate. We were going to have to run for it. Saying this now is easy, but in the moment, the idea of this thing seeing us was horrifying, and I was almost paralyzed by terror. But as a parent, keeping my children safe overrode anything else I may have felt. I hashed out the path we would take, and after a few deep breaths, we took off, me carrying the youngest. We had gone about halfway, and I thought we were going to get away unseen when I heard it. It sounded like a bleating mixed with a screaming person. It was piercing, and I stumbled when I first heard it. My oldest, a few feet ahead, stopped mid-run and covered his ears. I shifted my youngest to one arm and grabbed the other's hand as I passed him. We could see the back door ahead of us, and the sound must have drawn my wife's attention. She opened the door wide-eyed and caught sight of us running towards her. I shouted for her to get back inside, and my voice seemed to aggravate the thing. I could hear a slight gust of wind like something taking off, and bleeding rose into the air behind us. But closer, we dashed the last few yards to the back door and dove inside the house, landing in a pile. My wife slammed the door closed, and we all sat in complete silence. The noise continued for another few moments, coming from all around the house like it was circling until it eventually faded away and then was gone altogether. We were a little banged up from falling into the house, but otherwise okay. My grandparents had snoozed through the entire scenario, and when I asked them what it was, they couldn't really come up with an answer. We stayed another day and ended up cutting our trip a day short. Part of me felt terrible about leaving my grandparents there with that thing in the area, but on the other hand, they had lived there for 70 years without incident. Of course, I have heard stories of monsters like the New Jersey Devil, and the thing we saw matched the description. But there's no way that it's actually real and that we encountered it, right?